If God is slow to anger and patient, since God is slow to anger, we're always learning. Since God is slow to anger and patient, then why, when man first sinned, was his wrath and punishment so severe and long-lasting?
Time out. Didn't we just have that question a second ago?
We did.
Yeah,
It's a little,
I think
little,
we
little
did.
nuance.
That God's punishment for Adam was so severe. This creature from the dirt defied the everlasting holy God. After that, God had said, "The day that you shall eat of it, you shall surely die." And instead of dying, Thanatos, that day, he lived another day and was clothed in his nakedness by pure grace and had the consequences of a curse applied for quite some time. But the worst curse would come upon the one who seduced him, whose head would be crushed by the seed of the woman. And the punishment was too severe? What's wrong with you people? I'm serious. I mean, this is what's wrong with the Christian church today. We don't know who God is, and we don't know who we are. The question is, why wasn't it infinitely more severe? If we have any understanding of our sin and any understanding of who God is, that's the question, isn't it?
If God is...
Okay, can everyone hear me? Sorry if this is a little awkward, but I'll be running back and forth to switch the video. So anyone want to guess who we're talking about in biography tonight? R.C. I thought there was no better video to start with as an introduction to R.C. Sproul than that. Has anyone seen that before? One of the more popular kind of buzz clips that have come out and turned into a GIF. But I think it was a funny video to start with, kind of an icebreaker, but also perfectly summarizes R.C. Sproul to me, which is someone who was a brilliant mind, unafraid to be very direct when he needed to be, someone who very easily captured people's attention, and the type of person that when he raises his voice, you hear him and you listen. So I thought that was maybe a good video to jump into. So we'll talk about R.C. Sproul tonight. I want to give some background on why I chose R.C. Sproul as someone I wanted to highlight. And another kind of clarification before we start. I only found out I was teaching Wednesday, so part of, and I told Sam there was a mix-up in the schedule. I said, hey, I've got to teach. She said, oh, well, good thing you've been reading his biography already. And I said, well, I'm 1/4 of the way through, and I just made it to the part where he starts his ministry. So I don't feel prepared for tonight, and I am going to, hopefully do the biography more on his background and upbringing, which is, one, what I've read and I'm prepared for, but two is probably what you don't know about R.C. Sproul. I would imagine R.C. Sproul, of the people that we've talked about, is probably one of the most known people. We talk about, these theologians that weren't really alive during our time. You may not know as much about them. R.C. Sproul, you probably have some knowledge, but you may not know about his background and upbringing. So I'll try to highlight that, and then if there's time at the end, there's another video that I'm going to pull up if we have time. That video is by Ligonier, and it's I think, produced by, or at least features, the guy who wrote his biography. It'll go through some of the same things we'll talk about tonight, but it'll give you some glimpses into his teaching and kind of a bigger span of his ministry, so you won't get too cheated. So that's the plan for tonight. I want to briefly kind of explain why R.C. Sproul is someone who I have wanted to highlight from the moment that we were asked to do a biography series. So I grew up in a small PCA church, very similar to Redeeming Grace. We had small groups that my parents led for years, and we would often turn on the Sproul VHS tapes. My dad had the VHS and then the cassette tapes, and a lot of times when there wasn't a lesson prepared or we were doing some series, they would pop in a VHS and we would watch R.C. Sproul on the chalkboard talking to his class. Personally, my background, I grew up in a strong Christian family, strong Christian household, great godly parents and grandparents. Went to a Reformed Christian school, so I was really immersed in it 6 days a week. But I was really a child. I mean, really up until post-marriage, I think. I kind of knew what to do and say and act and, those types of things. But, a lot of it was just kind of going through the motions. And so I look back at all of this great teaching I had growing up, and I, am ashamed that I don't remember half of it, or, probably less than that. But I think by God's grace, R.C. Sproul is someone who it is an emotional, I have these great memories of watching these tapes, even though, I look back and I don't know what I got from it. I think by God's grace, that teaching was there. I'm very thankful for it. So he's become more important to me as I've aged and actually read his stuff and understand and watch his videos, and have read about him, and I'm thankful for his ministry. So that's why I'm really excited to do this lesson. He's a really interesting person. He parallels Spurgeon in a lot of ways that interest me, in that he is kind of a funny theologian, someone who is very relatable, someone who can take a very complex topic and kind of dumb it down to people like me so we can understand, which I really appreciate. So I'm excited about this. What do you think of when you hear R.C. Sproul? When I say R.C. Sproul, you probably have some thoughts. Like, what are the things that you associate with R.C. Sproul? Chalkboard. Yeah, me too. Ligonier, yep. Anything else? A lot of books. Tons and tons of books. As I read last night, he apparently wrote the biography of his basketball coach or something like that at one point. I mean, he has just books on books. Holiness of God, yeah. Yeah, if there's one defining thing about Sproul's ministry, it is not just the book Holiness of God, but the topic Holiness of God. Anything else? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, he is. He captivates an audience no matter the age. There are, I think, a few theologians who have done that well. He's one of them. And I'd say just his communication. There's something about him that you want to listen. So, anything else? Okay, so good. So you don't know a ton about his background, so hopefully some of the stuff I have prepared you haven't heard before. So what I want to do is kind of go through his upbringing, the early years of Sproul. I'm going to go through his relationship with his father, how that impacted his life. I want to go through some of his schooling. He was definitely an academic. And then we'll get into Ligonier a little bit, and then hopefully have time to watch the video. So R.C. Sproul was born in Pittsburgh in 1939. He died in 2017, so he was 78. He was preaching up until right before he died. He was born in Pittsburgh. He comes from a long line, and there's some very interesting ties where his, I think, family has ties to John Knox, and he comes from, I think, other pastors. But he was born in Pittsburgh, and if you are familiar with Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, has a reputation. It's the Steel City, and it's got kind of a hardened, grizzled reputation. And particularly in that time, right before the war, and then you read up through the 70s, I think it probably produced people who were a bit hardened and grizzled. And I think Sproul kind of took some of those traits into his ministry. Maybe you saw a few of those in the video just now. But he met his future wife, Vesta, in the first grade. So he was in the first grade, she was in the second grade, and he said from the moment he saw her, he knew she was going to be his wife. And I think maybe people say that, but he knew that somehow. And they were pretty much an item from that point. So they would kind of be on and off, but they would go through middle school, high school, and then into college as an item, and would later be married when he was in college. He grew up in a Christian home. His father was a Christian. He did go to I think they were going to a Methodist church, and then they moved to a very liberal PCUSA church. Although he didn't know that at the time, he was not saved early. We're going to talk about his conversion later in college. He was not saved. He did attend church. He was, from kind of everything we know, a very kind and reasonable kid who went to church and sung in choir and did all these things, cared for his father. And so he didn't really know that he was in a very liberal PCUSA church until later on in life. And I'll hopefully tell a story about that too. So he grew up in a great Christian home, but he didn't convert until later. I'll talk about his father in a second. One thing you may not know about R.C. Sproul, and I'd heard maybe little bits of this, but didn't really know how much of an athlete he was. He was an incredible athlete. He was a tri-sport scholarship athlete in college, which is just unbelievable when you think about it. A two-sport athlete is a really big deal in college. A three-sport athlete, and particularly the three major sports. He played baseball, football, and basketball. He was, the top scorer on his high school basketball team, an incredible baseball player, and kind of a very rough football player. So he was an athlete and loved doing that. He gave it up briefly when he was in high school to take care of his family, but that was something that I thought was kind of interesting. A lot of accolades for that. Huge Pittsburgh Pirates and Steelers fan. But when he was about 4 years old, his father, who was working at some type of recruiting center for the war, his father, he was an accountant, said it always dressed in a coat and tie. He came home, was kind of a very orderly man, and he said, I can't keep sending young men off to war unless I go. My conscience, I feel like I have to also go. So he left his family, went overseas in Christmas of 1942, so R.C. was 3 or 4 years old. And I didn't write down the date, but I think he was there for the next 3 or 4 years. And so it was a good bit of his young life that his father was overseas. But he adored his father. His dad would write him letters. They have some documented letters that his father would write him from Italy. And they're just the sweetest letters, a father to his young son, asking how his dog's doing and how he's doing in school, and kind of encouraging him and also keeping him in line. And so they're just a great relationship, but R.C. definitely missed his father. And so he finally came back, and they kind of moved on, and he had a pretty normal upbringing. However, a little bit later, his father had a stroke, and R.C. was, I think, mid-teens at the time. And he essentially stopped playing sports to help take care of his dad, and he would physically pick him up and move him around the house every day. So he would get him up from his bed, he would bring him to the table, he would move him to the living room, he would put him to bed, and he's a young man at the time and has such love for his dad that he is physically, day after day, during, an interesting time of his life, physically going and laboring over his father, which is really sweet. He had lots of memories of his father sitting in his chair, really unable to speak clearly or to move, but with a big magnifying glass in his Bible, just reading through the Bible. And at the time, he was going to church, R.C. was, but not really a believer, but remember seeing his dad just consistently reading the Word. Towards the end of his high school years, he was helping his dad into his bed one night. He would go up and he would pick him up under the arms and carry him to bed. And as he's carrying him down the hallway to the bedroom, his dad stops him. They kind of sit down to the side for a second. And his dad says, and he's got this kind of slurred speech. He says, "I have fought the good fight of the faith. I've run the race, and I've finished the course. I've kept the faith." And R.C. didn't recognize that as scripture, didn't know what he was saying, but it scared him, and he responded, "Don't say that, Dad." Just kind of, admonished him for what he said. Put him to bed. A few minutes later, he hears a thump. He finds his father on the floor. He would go into a coma, I think then, would never wake up. He would passed away a few days later. And throughout his ministry, he referenced this several times. And it was something that haunted him for the rest of his life, really, that he was so ignorant and immature at the time that he hears his father, who is making this, great proclamation right before he dies of, keeping the faith. And R.C. kind of chides him for it as a son to a father. And he looks back on it and he said, "I was just so immature, I didn't, But he had to live with that the rest of his life, and he talked about, I couldn't go back and redo it, and I had to live with that was the final thing I ever said to my father. He had a great, I'm going to read his words. He said, "In his final moments, my father tried to leave me with a legacy to live by. He sought to overcome his own agony by encouraging me. He was heroic. I shrank from his words of cowardice. I shrank from his words in cowardice. I could not face what he had to face. I pled ignorance as I only understood enough of his words to recoil from them. I had no faith to keep, no race to finish. I rebuked my father in the most valiant moments of his life. How much value did my father have to me then? I would have done anything I could, given everything I had, to bring him back. I had never tasted defeat so final or lost anything so precious." So really a heartbreaking story of a son losing his father. You think about the teenage years being fairly turbulent in a man, as he's kind of coming of age and thinking through what he believes and, going through all of these changes, and then to lose a father. But you kind of start to see the prick, I think, in his life at this point, where he's had a great life into this point. He's had a great relationship with his family. He's a stud athlete who has multiple offers going off to college, and then he kind of suffers his first real loss, and he feels something that he hasn't really felt before. So you start to see some workings in his life. A couple years later, he would go off to Westminster College. So this is also in Pennsylvania. He went to Westminster College. I think his wife was attending a college, an hour away or so. So they were dating at the time. But he went there to play 3 sports. So he was really going there, yes, for an education, and was excited about that, but really to play sports. And so he had 3 sports to prepare for every year, plus the academics. And so he was definitely a man who loved working and loved being busy. And so in one of his early weeks of college, he and his roommate had decided that they would go to Youngstown, Ohio, which at the time had this reputation for not carding underage people. And so said, "We'll go over to Youngstown, we'll drink, we'll party, and we'll do, all this stuff." At the time, he he was a smoker most of his life, so he was smoking at the time, so they were heading out the door, and he said, let me grab some cigarettes, and so he walked over to, I think, what was like a cafeteria area, and he went to get some cigarettes. And so he's getting them from, I think it was a machine, and he looks over, and there are two members of the football team sitting at a table kind of, near them, and they're upperclassmen, and so the guys wave him over because, he's a member of the football team. And they wave him over, and he comes over, and they're kind of hunched over this table together talking. What are they doing? So he comes over, and they're doing a Bible study. So these two big upperclassmen are doing this Bible study. And one of the guys takes the Bible and just turns it around and says, look at the Bible. And he looks down, and he reads the second half of Ecclesiastes 11:3. Can anyone quote Ecclesiastes 11:3? Does anyone have any idea what it's talking about? Any themes? Probably not. It's not a popular verse. Nope, not a time for. That would make more sense, I think. No, so here's Ecclesiastes 11:3. If a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Okay, so he reads that verse, and he is cut to the core. He is completely cut by that verse. He says, I think I was the only person to ever be converted by Ecclesiastes 11:3. And I went and I read, and I have a MacArthur Study Bible that I love, that always has the notes that can answer my questions. And I went and I looked at the verse, and I looked at the notes. I said, surely there's going to be something that will just it'll make sense to me. And there's nothing. But he talks about how when he heard this verse, and I'll read it again, if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. So when he saw this verse and he read this verse, he thought, I am this tree. I am this dead, decaying tree that is lying, doing nothing. I am broken. I'm not alive. I'm just this big tree. And he goes straight up to his room. He drops to his knees, and he asks the Lord for forgiveness. And he was converted that night, just like that. Really an incredible story. I think that, and I think I may have made this point later on, but there are some parallels again to Spurgeon where it's just you have this person who is raised in a Christian home, is very smart, is very able, and is not converted until the thing that you would never have thought, the verse that you would never have picked to convert one of the greatest theologians of our age, and he's converted with this verse. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no greater testament that I've read to the word being sharper than that, and that the word is alive, and that there was no expository preaching going on about this verse that converted his mind, and he thought about it, and it cut him like that. So really amazing. From that point on, he was pretty well obsessed with the Bible, theology, and he read the Bible over the next few weeks, and he really just was all-consuming, sermons, anything he could get his hands on. He went into college a history major. Right after his conversion, he changed it to religion, and then he changed it to philosophy later on, and philosophy would be his major, for the rest of his time in college. His wife, Vesta, had a somewhat similar conversion, kind of sudden conversion. Not too long after, she came up to visit him in his college. He invited her to a Bible study. And remember, they had sung in choir together. They had been to church kind of all of their lives together. but he invites her up, and they go to a Bible study, and she talks about, I forget exactly what the details of her conversion, but she's converted in this Bible study, and she talks about how she felt the Holy Spirit move, that she had never felt before, and that it was just a very real change in her heart when she was converted. He would read Billy Graham's sermons during classes that he did not find interesting, kind of behind his book, so he'd prop up his book and just read sermons. I think there's a reference to this in one of his kids' books. And so I mentioned that he went to a very liberal PC USA church. So he calls his pastor, his hometown pastor, to tell him this good news of this conversion. And he calls him, and he's expecting, this is a man who's been my pastor growing up. He's going to be very excited, that I've been converted. So he calls to tell him this news. And I don't know exactly what he said to him, but the response of the pastor was, and I'll read it in quotes, if you believe in the physical resurrection of Christ, you're a damn fool. Coming from a pastor. And so he realizes at this point that he's been kind of immersed in this very liberal theology. And it would be a theme of the rest of his kind of academic life that he would be placed in areas of extreme liberal theology. And he would have one or two professors or friends who would be conservatives, who would be encouragements to him. But for whatever reason, he would kind of find himself in these colleges that were very, very liberal. So R.C. calls that his first conversion, and then he had a second conversion in college, I think a year or two later. Has anyone in here read The Holiness of God? Probably his most famous book. Parts of it, okay. Me too. Sam read it last year. We felt like, can't believe we haven't read this book. I went to read it. I went outside on the back porch one evening. I had my iPad here. I had my freshly rebound leather Bible that a friend of mine did, and then I had The Holiness of God. And then I left them all out there, and there was a torrential downpour that night. My iPad came away unscathed, and it works just fine for some reason, but the book was completely ruined. So if you have another copy in your library, I'll buy it from you. So I've read parts of it, and I had read this story, which is one of the opening stories of Holiness of God. But what he calls his second conversion really, I think, sets the stage for the rest of his ministry going forward. And so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll kind of just give you the highlights. He's a believer. He's been a believer now for a year or two. He is in college. He's living on campus. And he goes to bed one night and, for whatever reason, is extremely restless. He can't sleep. He's rolling over. And he just feels like, I can't get to sleep, I can't rest, and he just feels this urge to get up and take a walk. And it is, it's not Pittsburgh, but it's near Pittsburgh, so it is the middle of winter in Pennsylvania, and I used to travel to Pennsylvania for work a lot, and I did not like the middle of winter in Pennsylvania. So it's very cold, it's snow everywhere, and so he gets up and he puts on his coat, and it's like midnight, he walks out, and he said, it's this incredibly still night, snow-covered, everything, no one out. And so he takes this walk, and he walks to the chapel on campus. And I can't do it justice. I would encourage you to read it because he's an incredible writer. And when he describes places and things, you just feel like you're there. And it's just so vivid. And so he describes, walking up to the chapel doors and them being this big, wooden doors that he's creaking open at midnight, and he can hear the gears clicking on the clock up at the top. And he walks in, and he says, his feet on the floor, they remind him of like the German soldiers' boots on the cobblestone path, and he's walking, and he feels like he's utterly alone. It's the middle of the night in the dead of winter, and he's in this big chapel that's completely empty. And he walks to the front of the church, and he kneels down, and he feels completely and totally alone. And then suddenly he feels God's presence. And he talks about feeling just this unbelievable, and he describes it in these contrasting, in one sense he's terrified, and in another sense he can't get enough of it and he never wants to leave. And so he just sits in this and he experiences what he described for the first time as, part of God's holiness and the presence of God. And I'll read one quote from him. He said, "I had fallen in love with Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, but on this occasion I suddenly had a whole new understanding of the character of God the Father. I knew in that hour that I had tasted the Holy Grail. Within me was born a new thirst that could never be fully satisfied in this world." So from that night on, he felt he had experienced something that he wanted to share with everyone. And it kind of was one of the starts of a lifelong work to proclaim the holiness of God and the importance of understanding God's holiness to everyone. And so he felt like he had tasted this thing and he just wanted to share that. And so if there's one defining thing about R.C. Sproul and his ministry, it's consistently teaching on God's holiness and how, and you saw it in the video, that's another thing I failed to mention at the beginning. Another reason I think that video is so incredible, it summarizes him in a lot of ways, is that it is driving home the state of man and the state of God and what a divide there is and how holy God is. And you see this, and I think one of the great things about R.C. Sproul is that you can go on YouTube and you can watch hours and hours of his teaching, whereas maybe you can't with some of the theologians that we've talked about. But you see this in little clips all the time where he answers questions about grief and about feeling angry at God, and it all comes back to God's holiness. And so that experience is what he called his second conversion. So his first conversion testifies to the knowledge that R.C. had of himself as a dead tree, powerless, unable, rotting, dead and decaying. His second conversion testifies to who God is in his transcendent being, alive, eternal, all-powerful, and holy. There's a really cool imagery. So cool story. He talked about this a lot. It was kind of the beginning of his probably most popular book. And all of this is within 2-3 years of going to college. I'll stop there for a second because I've been talking a lot. Any questions, comments, or anything?
That short video secondarily reveals the state of the church. Broad brushstroke, I get that, but
Yep.
it shows the state of the church as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was 2014, so it's been a while, and I don't think a lot has changed in that respect.
R.C.'s mom.
What's that?
R.C., do you have a mom?
He did, yes. Yeah, I didn't read a ton about her. He talked a lot about how his parents had a wonderful marriage. When he grew up, he saw that his mother absolutely loved his father, was vocal about that in her actions and her words. She took care of the kids while her dad was at war. I'll get into this in a second, but when he went overseas to study, and then when he came back, he was ordained as a minister, and it was one of the most proud moments of her life, and I think it was right before she died. So I didn't read a ton, as much about her, but a great mother from everything we saw.
I think it's interesting because oftentimes with people like R.C. Sproul, we think, oh, well, they're so popular with us, right? That we extrapolate their popularity
Yeah.
to their whole life. And I think what's interesting, and you'll probably get into his ministry and how alone he was, as you stated before, he always found himself alone, conservative amongst
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I thought consistently reading that account was, man, if I were to have a child or a friend who had just gone through a conversion like that, I would want to yank them out of all those schools and all those environments and put them into good places, because reading through those events of his life, all I could think was, it is just amazing that he became maybe the most, popular or influential Reformed theologian of the present day. But the Lord is sovereign, and it worked through that. So, yeah, good point. All right. So he proposes to Vesta while they're in college. They get married, and they have their first child a few months after he graduates college. And it was pretty well set at this point that he was kind of going to be an academic to some degree for the rest of his life. And so he leaves Westminster, and he goes to Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, very liberal seminary at the time, except for one man. Anyone know who that might be? Somewhat famous. What's that? Yeah, John Gershner. So he goes to Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and he studies under John Gershner. Did not like Gershner at all when he first met him. He actually had a very good encounter with the leading liberal theologian of the university, and became quick friends with him before he really knew anything, and had a kind of a bad interaction with Gershner right off the get-go. Did not like him at all. Remember, he went to college not a believer. He leaves college converted, but he goes into seminary not a Calvinist and very much against the concept of predestination. And so he meets Gershner at the time, who is teaching on predestination and these things, and he's very turned off. But very quickly, Gershner becomes a mentor to him, and they have a very special relationship. He influenced him in a number of ways. Gershner was a big Jonathan Edwards person. Sproul became very deep in Jonathan Edwards and very influenced by that. Gershner was also one of the only, if not the only, conservative faculty member at the university. So he talks about how he would basically just be quiet in staff meetings because he knew the entire staff was against whatever he'd say. So he would speak up on big things, but no one agreed with him at all. And so it's very interesting. You look at Sproul, and it's God's sovereignty, but he ends up in, there's 15 different classes, and 14 of them are liberal professors. He gets the conservative guy. And you see this kind of pattern as he goes through schooling. But he becomes very influenced by Gershner. And I only did this a week or two ago, if you go to YouTube and you look up John Gershner and you watch him and listen to him, I had not listened to him yet, but I have listened to a lot of Sproul growing up at the chalkboard, and you hear Gershner and you hear Sproul. I mean, the way that he speaks, I remember, I grew up a huge Kobe Bryant fan, and I was a Kobe Bryant fan. I had everything. And when I saw the Last Dance Michael Jordan documentary, I was like, that's why I like Kobe, because Kobe emulated the physical mannerisms that Jordan did. I mean, a lot of the shrugs, all these different things. So that's kind of how Sproul was. He took a lot of just the mode of speech, the writing on the blackboard. That was all Gershner's influence. And so it's interesting, like not only his theology and his material, but also just mannerisms can be picked up in that way. So it's pretty cool. Kind of an interesting note, when he was at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, he studied alongside someone who definitely more famous than R.C. Sproul, Fred Rogers. Anyone know that? Yeah. So I knew he was PC USA, but didn't know that they were classmates apparently. So that was kind of cool. Okay, so he He finishes at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and he and his wife were very poor at the time. They had never really made any money. He had been a student. They had kids. And so he's like, well, maybe now's the time that I get a real job and I actually go to a church and become a pastor. And so he starts sending out resumes and kind of pursuing this, only to find out that Gerstner was calling each church that he would reach out to and telling them, hey, he would really be much better suited if he pursued his doctorate before he went into full-time ministry. And so he realized, I'm not going to get a job doing this. And so he goes to Gerstner and he says, what should I do? And so he tells him, you should pursue your doctorate. He sends him to Amsterdam, the Free University of Amsterdam. And he speaks, no Dutch. It is an unbelievably demanding coursework, the reading. There's a famous story where he spent 12 hours one day on one page because he was looking up every word, and he was making note cards and learning the language. And so he goes over there, again, young family. He found time for sports. He played baseball over there. So anyway, he goes over there. Not going to go into it a ton, but does very well there. Right before he finishes, however, he comes back to the States to be ordained, primarily because his mother was passing away, so he wanted to come back. But he comes back and he's ordained, he's ordained, and then they grab him for a teaching position, and it becomes pretty clear he's not going back. He had every intention of going back to finish his doctorate. Becomes very clear he's not. He ends up teaching at Westminster, his alma mater. He teaches philosophy. And that kind of begins then his ends, he would go back to school to get PhD, but ends his kind of learning academia and then starts his teaching at that point. And so he begins teaching. He goes to Gordon College, and he kind of finds that he's somewhat miserable because it's a very fundamentalist environment. There's a story I thought was really funny. He was a smoker at the time, and he walks into one of the offices, and the receptionist says, "Oh, Mr. Sproul, you smell like you've been around someone who's been smoking." And I can hear him saying this in my head at least, and he says, "Indeed I have, it is I." But he really dislikes that, and so he kind of starts looking for what's next. So he leaves Gordon College, and then he goes to Conwell Seminary. And you can probably guess what happens because of those two names. But he's teaching at Conwell Seminary. He finds he really doesn't like that much either. I think that was at Temple. And then the two merge, and they try to recruit him to join Gordon Conwell, and he tells them basically no. I really have no interest in that. But what he finds through teaching both at Gordon College and then at Conwell Seminary is that while he dislikes the teaching jobs that he has, he loves adult Sunday school. So his local churches, he absolutely loves teaching adult Sunday school. And so it's the first time you start to kind of see where Ligonier will go. And he just starts to see that he has this passion for teaching kind of the everyday person, the person who's going to work, on Monday morning. And he just has this passion for that person. So he hopped around colleges, and then he finds himself teaching at these various places, and he gets invited to a Young Life conference and is asked to do a 5-part series on the holiness of God. And that was kind of the start of Ligonier. That's where, go ahead.
I don't recall the specifics of the story, but it's like an AME church or something that he was.
Yeah, I was gonna, yeah.
I found that story one of the most fascinating ones because there's a criticism of R.C. Sproul, right, that it's just white, wealthy evangelicals that he appeals to, which is not true.
Right.
He's explicating the Bible, but this story was one of the best
Yeah, I thought this story was great too. I should have included it. So he's preaching, and he gets invited to preach at this church, this black church, right? Right. Yeah. So he's at I think Conwell Seminary is on campus of Temple like it's a part of Temple, and so he's taking the train into Philly. So he comes in to preach, and he starts to preach. And they are interacting with him so much during his preaching that he gets flustered. And he kind of calls the pastor to, like, what do I do? And so the pastor of the church comes out and says, like, look, people, you need to calm down and just let him preach. Like, he's not used to this. And then the pastor says, and that's when the ghost came by. And that's when the ghost came by R.C. would say that was the greatest compliment he had ever been given, that he begins preaching and then the Holy Spirit comes in. And so is that the story you were?
Yeah, the pastor was in his class.
Yeah, that's right.
They invited him to come teach, and then he's, it's historic black church.
Yep.
Lots of call and answer. And then, and the pastor said that the next day, when in class, the students are kind of deriding, jabbing at R.C. as
Yeah.
the professor, like, how'd it go? And he's like, well, and the student who was the pastor stands up and says that's when the ghost came by and kind of shut everyone up.
Yeah.
He's like, it was
Yeah.
something special.
Yeah. Awesome story. All right, so we're probably not going to be watching the video. I'll send a link out. Okay, so he's asked to teach a 5-part series on holiness of God at a Young Life conference. He is approached by a lady whose name I thought I wrote down, but I didn't. And she's very impressed by him. She had some thoughts about a ministry herself, and she's a very wealthy lady. And she basically says, if you could have anything that you wanted to, ministry-wise, what would it be? And he describes this, what he calls study center, where he could teach on various topics that were all, related to theology in some way. But not something that was a seminary, not something that was necessarily for pastors. And so she buys a 52-acre lot and begins construction. And so she starts building it. And this was in the Ligonier Valley, so hence the name Ligonier. And it was outside of the city, outside of Pittsburgh, but not too far away, but kind of this nicer area, somewhat secluded. And he would live on the grounds. And so to begin, there was like one main building, and he lived in this building. And then they, after a year or two, realized that they really were never alone. And so every night there were people in there. They had people over for dinner and these things. And so they had absolutely no privacy, no time for their family. So they built a building behind the main center. And they lived there for a year, and they found that they were never alone. And so then they built another house in, a couple, I forget how long, but it's somewhere else on the property, somewhat secluded, and then that's where they would live. And so this was kind of the founding of Ligonier. And this is where I ended with my reading before I found out how to teach. So I don't have much after this, but Ligonier was interesting on a number of levels at the time. This would have been in the 70s. And so when you think about Ligonier, one of the things I think of is tapes, so both cassette tapes and audio tapes. So they were one of the first ministries using that technology to record his talks and distribute them out of Pennsylvania. And so they would mail them all over the country. And then they became one of the first ministries using video to record videotapes. And they have these great 70s style posters that say, is your church ready for video? That kind of thing. And they were calling churches and really selling churches on video as a great ministry tool. And they would go so far as to purchase VHS players and send them to churches to get them to, be able to watch the videos. And so they started just doing a lot of this teaching and distribution. The study center became this great hub of all kinds of people, not just pastors, not just seminary students, but anyone who wanted to study and hear his teaching. There were some somewhat famous people who also went there. Very quickly after the founding of Ligonier, he starts Table Talk, which is the monthly magazine, and is still running. So I think it's been over 50 years, maybe. And so Table Talk magazine, one of the primary ministries, over time would also create the Reformation Study Bible, or the New Geneva Study Bible. He would be the editor of that, and then kind of spent his life doing work. Ligonier's still going strong, has a board that includes a lot of the top theologians today. Very active ministries. They do a Renewing Your Mind podcast every day, where they push out teaching both from Sproul and others. And so that's where I had planned to stop, but I want to stop again with only a few minutes to go. I don't think I'll show the video. But what other questions or topics, or is there anything there's tons that I've missed. Anything you want to add? Yeah, definitely. We've picked them up out there before. That's one thing I can remember growing up, that my dad always had Table Talk in the house.
Just by way of comment, the church that I served before is that we purchased a number of those series by R.C. Sproul, and we would use them for Sunday school class. We would play, if I remember right, those series were probably 30 to 40 minutes
Mm-hmm.
long. And then the balance of the time of Sunday school, then we would interact in the class biblically out of just compare with the scriptures, and just questions would come up. But those courses, they're absolutely worth their weight in gold.
Yeah, they are. I pulled one up because they're all on YouTube too. I mean, Ligonier has pushed out a lot of that stuff where you can just stream it quickly. And I pulled one up last week, kind of at random, on anxiety, and just watched half an hour of him teaching on anxiety and scribbling words that you can't read on the blackboard. And just, it's incredible. I mean, his teaching is great. And I think the thing that, I think I probably said this already, but the thing that I think makes him so easy to pick up is that he really did intentionally, and he talks about this, he tried to take theology and not dumb it down, but tell it in a way that made sense to anyone, and so make it very, consumable. And he didn't do that at the expense of the theology, and he didn't do that without a lot of Latin. If you watch R.C. Sproul, you'll learn a lot of Latin. But he just had a way of communication. And I would say, too, it's very rare to have someone who is as gifted in speaking and communicating in that respect, and in writing. That's one thing I talked about. Spurgeon was gifted in both. Sproul's books are, I think, very good, and he has that gift there as well.
Also somebody who's gifted in theology
And philosophy, that's right.
Yeah, I think people forget that he was a philosopher. He calls himself a philosopher first and foremost. That was his first love.
Yeah, and it seems weird because you hear that he was history and then moved to religion and then switched out of it, and then that's what he kept.
Allows him to defend the faith very logically and just work through a lot of the bogus theological arguments that were being made, and I think we take for granted how much philosophy is in our basic.
Yeah.
Just the way we would talk even now
And
about it. It was eye-opening to me that didn't really exist in the church as much, or had been lost, and he kind of rediscovered that going back to Aquinas, Augustine.
Yeah, he's kind of credited as repopularizing a lot of Reformed theology. And I don't know enough about this to present it, but I think a lot of that's Gershner's influence too with apologetics, because he came in with one kind of view of apologetics called presuppositionalism, I think. That was changed through his time in seminary. And he certainly did, and I think another thing that was so appealing about Sproul is that he argued logic and philosophy, and he really made you think, Christian or not. And he'll use stories of that. And one of the videos I was watching, he talks about asking a non-believer this question, asking them this, and kind of leading them through this, and it's really cool. It's time to go, so I'm gonna end with his final words of his final sermon right before he died, which I thought were fitting into the class and to kind of his biography. He says, "So I pray with all my heart that God will awaken each one of us today to the sweetness, the loveliness, the glory of the gospel declared by Christ." And he passed away within a couple days, a couple weeks. So, really amazing man. Encourage you to watch his stuff, read his stuff. It's really good. And I will try to read Holiness of God again and pray for clear skies. All right, let's pray. Go. Father in heaven, thank you for this wonderful discussion tonight on R.C. Sproul. We thank you for his life and his ministry. Pray that studying this would embolden us to do the work that we've been put on earth to do, that it would give us hearts to learn more and study more and be eager to eat your word and to understand it more than we do right now. We pray that you would prepare us for the week ahead as we go into this new week. In Jesus' name, amen.
And Mary kept saying, ladder, I said, all we need is a pole. And Joe went and found a pole. Thank you. Hey, I enjoy this. And the Rick Lindsay, when I first started coming here, he showed a lot of Sproul stuff, and we'd have discussions and all open.
That's what I grew up doing in my
Yeah, I love it.
You've done a good job on researching that and speaking up.
And Gershon, yeah.
It's good to learn stuff like that about people that, that you don't know about it unless. I mean, they never say, tell y'all this. I've only been